Thank you. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Hi. So first, I just wanted to start by saying also Happy Mother's Day to all the moms in the room. And also, if there's any nurses in the room, Happy Nursing Week. We're just at the tail end of Nursing Week. And for the Manitobans in the room, go Jets, go! Okay, so clinical trials project manager, I just wanted to kind of tell you guys a little bit about my background and how I came to understanding clinical trials. So I used to work with the Leukemia Bone Marrow Transplant Program with Dr. Song, Dr. Sutherland, and I used to coordinate the clinical trials for a lot of the myeloma studies. So a lot of my experience, actually, I've been the coordinator for a lot of these drugs you're hearing about today. With that, then 2 years ago, I just had a career change and I went into clinical informatics. So now I'm taking all of that clinical trials experience and nursing experience and I'm applying it to our new upcoming electronic medical record. So you guys are probably going to hear about it. You've maybe heard a little bit about it in the news already. We just went live with Lionsgate and Squamish Hospital. So it's going very well. It's very busy. But yeah, so I've been working on designing the clinical trials application that's going to interface with that system. And so yeah, I've actually got a couple of slides today. I'm going to show you what that actually looks like. And really, my vision is kind of taking everything that I've learned and trying to make things as safe as possible for you when you go on a clinical trial. So today, what I wanted to start with is just kind of understanding some of the terminology, some of the jargon. Basically, what you've been hearing today already is, how, what happens with these drugs, the side effects and treatment options and things like that. So I want to talk about all of the how do we get these drugs? What is that clinical trials process and clinical research process? So I'm going to talk about the 4 phases of clinical trials. And also, while you're on the clinical trial, there's 3 phases while you're on a clinical trial. And then just a little bit about understanding what your responsibilities are when you're on that clinical trial. So first, let's go through some of the jargon, some of the lingo. So a participant, that's you. That's anyone who participates in a clinical trial. There's also a normal healthy participant. This is usually used for control groups. So sometimes they'll do studies where they're looking at the healthy population, so somebody without cancer, and comparing to a patient with cancer. And then standard of care, this is basically the treatment you would normally get if you weren't going to go on a clinical trial. And then treatment or study group, that's the group of participants that actually get the investigational drug, the study drug. Randomization, this is where a computer will randomly assign you to an arm of the study. So sometimes the studies have more than one arm, sometimes they're just open label one arm. But if there is any randomization, just so you know, we don't get to choose which arm you go on. It has to be randomly assigned, and a computer basically just flips a coin. And this is just to control any bias, because we wouldn't want, if the physician was constantly putting a certain type of patient on one of the arms, that would be biased, and then the data would be not clean. Placebo, you guys have probably heard of a placebo. This is a dummy drug, so sometimes it's a sugar pill, sometimes it's sugar water or salt water, but we wouldn't know, so the nurses and the doctors treating you won't know whether you're on placebo or not. And in general, just so you know, whenever we use placebos in cancer trials, you're always given some kind of active drug. We would never only put you on a placebo, never. So usually we would give you standard of care plus or minus the study drug. That's basically how it goes. So good clinical practice. This came about, this is an established Health Canada regulation. It's basically our Bible. It's a very long book, and it gives us the rules that we have to follow, and it's mainly pertaining to consent, so making sure that you are informed of whatever it is that we want to stick into your body, and making sure that you have enough information to decide that you want to do that, and also confidentiality. So we make sure that your confidentiality is respected so that the pharmaceutical companies, whoever is sponsoring the trial, they know about your physical characteristics, but they don't get to know your name and your birth. Well, they might know your birth date because we need age, but they won't know where you live or anything like that. When I say they won't know where you live, I mean your address. They would know by your site number which province or country you originated in, but they wouldn't know your address or your phone number. And then Health Canada also mandates that we keep all study files for a minimum of 25 years. So actually right now, because we're sort of in this hybrid system of paper and electronic right now. So this means that any of your research files, we actually have to keep them stored for another 25 years, even after the study closes. And this is just to make sure that if there was any issues, if some long-term data came out and Health Canada wanted to review your file, we have to actually let them review it. This issue of storage of files will go away once we're fully onto our electronic medical record, because we'll actually, oh, there's a computer screen right here. I'm like, where is my screen? They usually have one here. There it is. Just noticed. So yeah, in the electronic world, we actually keep your record indefinitely, so it never gets destroyed. So that issue will go away, because of course storage of your files is very expensive. Now some of those files, we have to keep a certain portion of your data separate from your regular clinical data. So your regular picture as a myeloma patient on your journey, we keep in the one file, but then your research data goes in a separate file. And that's a whole big long thing. I won't try to get into that. So investigators are basically the doctors who are running the clinical trial at the site. So there's always a primary investigator. So that's the one investigator or physician who's completely responsible for everything that happens on that clinical trial, even if they're not your treating physician. But they can also delegate out to their colleagues at the site. So those are called co- or sub-investigators. So it could be, say, Dr. Kevin Song's study. He's the primary investigator, but he can delegate out to all of his colleagues. So usually we would actually have all of the 13 bone marrow transplant physicians as co-investigators. So any of their patients could still be treated on the clinical trial. And then the sponsor of the study, this is generally the pharmaceutical company who is paying for reimbursing the site for anything that, any costs that are incurred that are deemed to be for the study. So they'll give us free drug, they'll pay for some of the tests, they'll pay for, sometimes they'll even pay for travel. So that's a really important factor to remember when you're being offered a clinical trial. Always ask if there's travel reimbursement. So we actually do treat patients here in Vancouver who come from Kelowna or come from Vancouver Island. It's more cumbersome, so you have to be well enough to still be able to travel to us, but at least you can get some of that reimbursed. Also, just to mention that sometimes universities as well can be the sponsor of the study. So there's this whole preclinical trials process as well, which Marie-Claude was actually talking about. This is where we first test these molecules on mice, and also testing the molecules just in a petri dish. It could be on cells. So first they usually test things on cells, then you move it to mice models, and then if everything looks okay, then we would go on to human clinical trials. And clinical research, this kind of gets a little bit confusing, but clinical research is sort of the umbrella which encompasses that sort of lab work all the way through to clinical trials. So it's sort of the umbrella term we use to describe everything. But clinical trials would sit underneath it. But clinical trials, of course, is a whole separate beast in itself, which I'll talk about in a second. But basically, yeah, it begins as the basic science in the lab, again, either on cells or on mice models. So many of you might be familiar with our hematology cell bank. So this would be considered clinical research. So many of you would have been offered this when you were newly diagnosed, and we just take some of your cells and we store them and we freeze them. And we do that so that when researchers come up who want to do their PhD, they can have, they have to come with ethics approval and things, but they can ask to use those cells to do their research and to try to answer some kind of a research question. So once the mice models, if everything looks good, then we can move to clinical trials. So this is just another sort of a visual schematic of the discovery of the drug in a lab. They test it on the mice models. Health Canada then approves that drug it's deemed safe enough to be tested in humans, and now we can start clinical trial process. So as I mentioned, clinical trial phases. So we actually have 4 phases. I don't usually talk about the 4th phase, but today I thought I would talk about it because it's been mentioned a few times. So phase 1, this is the earliest phase in the life of a new drug. It's usually done on not very many participants, so 15 to 50. The point here is, so in the mice models, they'll do testing to see what is the maximum dose that those mice could tolerate. They extrapolate that data, and then when we go to the human testing, we start small. So we actually give you a lower dose than what they had been giving the mice. So we start small, and then we incrementally dose increase. And we try to gather data on, mostly at this point, we want to make sure that the drug is safe, but we also want to see if it's actually working. But here, it's more so to see what is the drug, so it's more about safety. It's more about the side effect profile at this point. And then as long as it shows some promise that it's actually working, then we could go ahead to phase 2. Whoops, did I just go backwards? There we go. Yep, so here we're trying to determine that safe dose range. We're looking at the side effect profile. We also look at how the drug works in the body. So this is called pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, or pharmacologic behavior. So we're looking at how it's interacting with your cells inside the body and then how your body's excreting it. So we do a lot of testing. So the benefits for this phase of study is, so I always have to disclose, participants may not benefit directly from participating in the research themselves. However, the data that we collect could help, the entire myeloma group as a whole. This data collected will help inform whether to continue to phase 2. So it's all about trying to figure out what is the maximum tolerated dose. So we go up so I'll take pomalidomide, for example. We actually, in the clinical trials, we went as high as 5 milligrams, but that was deemed to be causing too many side effects. It just wasn't worth it. So we tailored it back to 4 milligrams. So that's why now, if you go on pomalidomide or Pomalyst, you usually start at 4 milligrams, unless if your doctor knows that if they are pretty sure you're not going to handle that, they might actually start you at a lower dose. But we would start you at 4 milligrams and then go down. That's once the drug is actually approved. And in phase 1, side effects, because we're still trying to gather that profile, they're still unpredictable. We know a little bit from the mice models what we think that the side effects are going to be, but of course when we put the drug into a human, you can have completely different side effects. Also of note, so today we're also doing trials where, so pembrolizumab is a good example, where they tried it in lung cancer, they tried it in melanoma, and then they tried it in myeloma. They're having really good effects in skin cancer and lung cancer, but of course in myeloma it's not a great drug, so it's been pulled. So sometimes even the same drug, depending on the tumor, can have different side effects and different outcomes. So phase 2, so if they've made it past phase 1, everything looks good, we've got our maximum tolerated dose and we've got some efficacy or effectiveness. So then we're going to start evaluating it in a larger population. So it's still not a huge amount of people, it's less than 100 participants, but they will also go cross sites. So they want to have more than one site. Phase 1 studies also go cross sites. So these are global clinical trials at this point. For phase 2, the focus is often on cancers where there's no effective treatment and that are most likely to show a response to the study. And also, of note, in phase 2, everybody's getting the same dose now. So you start at that maximum tolerated dose, and then we would dose reduce if you were having side effects, as opposed to starting low and going up. The objectives here are again to assess the effectiveness of the drug and also for additional safety info. So the stress here more on phase 2 is whether this is actually working, because now the drug company wants to know, is this one going to be ready to go for phase 3, which is where they're going to want to see and test it up against whatever the standard of care is. So they really need to see how effective this drug is. So again, benefits, certain participants may not directly benefit from participating. However, the data collected will inform whether to proceed to phase 3. You still can get some unpredictable side effects in phase 2, and these trials are usually too short to determine the long-term benefits. So we're not really looking at overall survival in phase 2, we're more looking at sort of the immediate efficacy of the drug. So then, if everything looks good, we can proceed to phase 3. So when we get to phase 3, these are those large multi-center trials with more than 100 plus participants. This is where we're now looking at that overall survival time. We're also usually collecting quality of life, making sure, how are you actually feeling on this drug? And of course, side effects, we're always collecting data for safety. Another thing that I don't have on the slide is that we're also starting to collect more and more healthcare economics. So we actually look at, if you're still working, we would be collecting data on how often are you having to come to the clinic and how is that affecting your work? Are you having to take time off work? How much time? And then are you getting admitted to hospital because of this clinical trial, and how's that impacting you financially? And then how is it impacting the hospital financially too? If the drug is causing too many hospital admissions, it's not good for you, obviously, and it's also not going to be good for the healthcare system. So all of these things are now being looked at and considered. And actually, in light of any sites that have electronic medical records, this data is actually a lot easier to collect. It's a lot tougher to collect this when you're just doing it on paper. So in a phase 3 study, this is where you have to the drug company has to compare their drug to whatever the standard of care is. So as I mentioned before, we would never just give you placebo. You would be getting standard of care plus or minus the active drug, or maybe it's inactive drug. Sometimes it's a blinded study, so we wouldn't know whether you were getting that study drug or not, but it's not always blinded. Sometimes it's open label, so you don't always get a placebo. And again, the objective here is just to determine whether that new therapy is better than whatever the gold standard is at that point. So if it's newly diagnosed, we would be measuring against, melphalan and prednisone was our standard backbone for many, many years. So Velcade, or bortezomib, when it first came out, it had to go head-to-head with melphalan prednisone. So people were randomized to the melphalan prednisone, and then the other half were melphalan prednisone bortezomib. And same with Revlimid, they had to go through the same thing with going up against either melphalan prednisone or bortezomib and dexamethasone. So in phase 3, again, participants may not benefit directly. However, the data is still going to help inform whether that drug should be approved by Health Canada or not. The risks, sometimes we find out that new treatment is not necessarily better than our standard of care. So if that happens, then that drug, I call that the loser drugs, they basically get dumped. And it's unfortunate because when you get to phase 3, a lot of time and effort has been spent and lives. And so when it turns out that drug's actually not going forward, that's pretty disappointing for everybody. But it does happen. And also sometimes side effects may be worse than those associated with standard of care. So sometimes when we add in that study drug, I'll use Doxil as the example. When we gave it in conjunction with bortezomib dexamethasone, we found that the side effects were a lot worse in that arm, comparing to just the standard bortezomib with dexamethasone. And then the survival, the extra benefit, it was really only a couple of months extra benefit. So it was sort of deemed that, well, we probably won't go forward with that drug in the myeloma setting anyway. They use it very well in ovarian cancer. But with us, it wasn't deemed, it was dumped, it was deemed a loser. And you can still get unexpected side effects in phase 1 and 2, just like in phase 1 and 2. And then phase 4, so we don't always do phase 4 studies, but these are really large multi-center trials with more than 1,000 participants. We're really collecting here some survival time, a little bit, still the side effect and quality of life can be measured, but we're actually collecting very little data for phase 4. These are also known as expanded access studies. It's always an open label drug. You can still be randomized sometimes to a certain thing, but usually it's open label. And really we're trying to determine more data, and basically we're waiting for regulatory approval at this point. So the drug company is very certain they're going forward, and we kind of use this in Canada as sort of a bridge program to try to give you the drug access while waiting for all of the approvals to go through. As you guys have probably, I'm not sure if it's been talked about already, but the approval process is very long. So from bench to actually doctor writing a prescription for the drug takes a minimum 10 years. So it's a long process. So the data also may help inform if that drug should be approved by Health Canada. So that's why sometimes this is it's a good bang for their buck for the pharma companies, because they'll still, Health Canada needs to look at that phase 3 data. That's going to be the most robust data. But sometimes if we can just add some of that phase 4 data, it just helps to inform that yes, this is a great drug. Let's fund it. Let's get it approved. And generally, the side effects are known by this phase. But still, of course, unexpected side effects can occur. In this case, it would be more, we would be looking at long-term side effects, so gathering those is also important. So another risk is if Health Canada actually rejects the approval of the drug, then the study can be stopped abruptly and you would be pulled from it and put it on something else. And also, if they went and got Health Canada approval while you were on this kind of a study, then we still have to wait for all the other approvals, the PCODER funding approval, and then the provincial approvals to go through. And if it's rejected by one of those funding committees, then again, we may not be able to continue to access the drug. And then we usually look to the pharma companies to try to get some special access and things like that. So we always are working to try to get access, but it's a cumbersome bureaucratic process. So how are you protected during a clinical trial? So first thing, we have to always have ethics board approval. Ethics boards are made up of lawyers, physicians, lay people, patients, just a whole statisticians, and they basically, we have to show them the protocol, and we draft up a consent form that we want to be handing to patients, and they'll look at it all and determine if it's okay or not. And they're always looking at it from the perspective of making sure that you're safe. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Health Canada has their GCP guidelines, which again helps to make sure that we're consenting you appropriately. So we can't just put you on a clinical trial without you knowing and actually giving consent, making sure your confidentiality is respected, and then making sure that the data is preserved for a long time so that if we needed to go back into that data for any reason, we can. The TCPS, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, it's more, it's also all the same stuff, kind of the same as GCP guidelines, same looking at making sure consent and confidentiality and all of that is respected. And then, of course, your study team. So everybody who's looking after you, they are looking to make sure that you are as safe as possible and making sure that they're in close contact with one another. So how is confidentiality respected? Well, we have PIPEDA, which is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. It's really boring, so I won't go into it, but it's protecting your confidentiality, so we can't just willy-nilly give out your information to anybody, and this is true whether you're on a clinical trial or not, actually. We can't just divulge your clinical information to anyone. Including personal information, so we would never give out your address, phone number, or SIN number. What can the sponsor know? They can know your date of birth, because we know that age and also ethnic background are really important demographics to study, because these drugs can behave differently in different ethnic backgrounds and also depending on your age. And then what else does the sponsor want to know? They want to know your side effects. They want to know any other medications you're taking, all the doses of the study drugs. So if we're having to go down, dose reduction, or if you're on phase 1, what doses you're going up. They need to know all of that. Admissions to hospital, any blood transfusions, any surgeries, all of that stuff. And as I said, we have this new electronic medical record that we've just flipped the switch on. And so you will be informed about any changes to and how any of this looks. So of course, in the electronic world, more people potentially can look at your data. However, we have other fail-safes to make sure that you still can't just willy-nilly go into somebody's chart without having the appropriate reason to be in there, including for researchers. I've actually created very specific research type roles that are given to researchers, so they have a limited view of the things in your chart. And this is just one example of, I wanted to just show you a couple of things that we've designed. So you can see up here, we have a process alert space. That's where they would be putting anything like this patient has a history of falls or difficult intubation, things like that. So I got us some space to put the flag up there that this patient's on a research study. So that whole blue area, this is called banner bar or demographics bar. So your name is there, your date of birth, age. So that's where that lives. And then on one of these summary pages, don't worry about that, but I've actually got our own clinical research space where it pulls in all of the trials that you've been on or are on, the status, so whether you're still on that trial or off trial, and the date. And this is to make sure that someone doesn't come along and try and put you on another clinical trial when you're already on a clinical trial. And it's also in order to make sure that we have a good record of what have you been on in the past, because this is the piece that's really lacking in our paper world. We have no idea what you were on 2 years ago. Your doctor could change, and it's often some chart that's filed in medical records, and they don't necessarily know, or it's off-site and it's stored at Iron Mountain in some research documentation, which is not safe for you. So we just wanted a little bit more exposure. And we've also got our own page in your chart, so to speak, pulls in all the same information as well as contact information. So if you got admitted to hospital somewhere, as long as you were on the same electronic system, they'll see it and they'll see exactly who to contact. So they'll know, oh, Cindy's the research nurse, I'm just gonna email her or phone her and find out a little bit more about this trial, or Dr. Song. So their names will pull in here. And then I've highlighted this box. I've actually got permission to upload, there's a whole list of, whenever you go on a clinical trial, here's all the medications that you cannot have, or maybe specific treatments that you cannot have. They're called prohibited medications. We're gonna upload them there, and basically we're teaching all the physicians, if they see patients on a research study, if they want to order a drug on you and they don't know anything about the clinical trial, they need to go there and see what they're not allowed to order. So that's the gist of it. There's actually a few more bells and whistles that we've designed, but those are the most transparent ones. So just quickly, I'll go through the phases while you're on a clinical trial. So first you have to sign a consent form, then there's all these screening procedures that you have to do. We determine if you're eligible or not based on the protocol. There's always inclusion, exclusion criteria. And then once you've passed all of those eligibility screenings, then we can proceed to the treatment phase. So there may or may not be a randomization if you make it to the treatment phase, but we would start on cycle 1, day 1. Randomization may or may not occur, and you will need to repeat a bunch of your blood tests or maybe skeletal survey or CT scan, something like that. And then during the treatment phase, you'd have these repeated periodically as well to make sure that everything's going okay. You'll be reminded about your most common side effects to watch out for, and that's so that you can report them back to us. And this is probably the most important thing, that if you just remember one thing from my talk today, remember this. Any side effects you have, write it down and make sure you tell us about it, and keep track of start dates, stop dates. If your general provider, your GP, puts you on any other medications, tell us about it as soon as possible. Even tell us about it before you actually swallow it, especially if it's an antibiotic or something, because as I mentioned, it might be prohibited. So make sure, let your study team know. Report all surgeries, hospital admissions. So the hospital admissions, this is going to get a little bit easier in the future because I've actually created an alert that if you were to get admitted to any hospital while you're on a clinical trial, as long as that hospital is on our Cerner electronic record, I'm going to get a notification in my inbox that you were just admitted to this hospital at this time on this date. So it gives us a little bit more real-time information so that we can follow up. Keeping a diary is very helpful. You could be on clinical trial for like 5+ years. So having a calendar and being able to look back is a really good way to keep track of what's been happening and all your side effects and all of your appointments, because you're going to probably have a lot of them. And it's important to note that for the most part, the way that we treat myeloma, that your treatment's going to continue for as long as you're able to tolerate it, and according to the study protocol. But we usually go until the treatment's not working anymore. So it could be years. So once it's deemed that you need to come off study, maybe it's for you're having unacceptable toxicities or side effects, and maybe it's because the study's closing for whatever reason, you have an end of treatment visit, and this also involves more blood tests and things we have to just double check before you go off. How are all of your liver, kidneys, everything doing? And then during the follow-up phase, you may have to still do some blood tests, but at the very least, you may still receive a phone call from the study staff, or they might just be able to go into your chart every 3 to 6 months, depending on what the follow-up frequency is. But basically, I just want you to know, most studies require follow-up until the participant dies. So you're still on that clinical trial, even if you're in the follow-up phase, just so you know. So, just to summarize, there's 4 phases of clinical trials. So there's phase 1, which involves a small number of patients. This is where we're trying to determine what is that maximum tolerated dose. Phase 2 involves more patients, and here we're trying to really determine the side effect profile and the efficacy and whether to proceed for phase 3. Phase 3 involves more than 100 patients. We're still trying to determine the side effect profile and efficacy data, and we're really comparing these drugs to the standard of care in hopes that we can then go for Health Canada approval. Phase 4, we're usually using these as a bridge program, but also to collect more data, more efficacy, more side effect profile data, which just helps with all of that Health Canada approval and reimbursement later. And then while you're on the clinical trial, there's 3 phases. So you have the screening phase, where we have to make sure that you're actually eligible for the study, and then the treatment phase, which could be years, where you're taking the drug according to protocol and followed closely by your study team, and then follow-up, which again could last until you pass away, because we want to collect that survival data and see how things are going. Your responsibilities, of course, make sure you take home that informed consent and read it and share it with whoever you want. You can share it with your neighbor, share it with your physician, share it with your family. Make sure that you feel comfortable to go on that clinical trial if you're considering it. And then side effects, make sure you report all side effects and keep a diary, because it'll be difficult to rely on your memory after a while. And then making sure you report all vitamins, herbs, those are also considered concomitant medications. I actually had a patient who was taking some kind of a herb, and I knew something was going on because he was doing totally fine, and then one day his pancreatic enzyme spiked. And so when I saw him, I was like, what, have you done anything different? And he says, Cindy, I was taking something. And I said, well, what are you taking? And he says, I don't know. It was something my guru gave me. It was some kind of tree bark boiled in water. So I don't know what it was exactly, but it was clearly not making his pancreas happy. So I told him to stop, and lo and behold, a week later, all of his pancreatic enzymes came back down. So just to show you, herbs can also have an effect. So make sure you just tell your team what you're taking, and they'll let you know if that one is a safe one or a dangerous one. And keep a diary. And here's some resources. I'm not going to go into how to search for clinical trials because Michelle is going to teach you that.